Bonjour à tous, good afternoon. It's my honor, Professor Raphaël Heffron, to introduce you today for a conference on the theme of the role of carbon capture storage in the just transition of low carbon economy. I would like to begin by thanking the Professor Raphaël Heffron to be here today. Raphaël Heffron is a professor for global energy law and sustainability at the Center for Energy, Petroleum and Mineral Law and Policy at the University of Dundee in Scotland, and a Jean Monnet professor in the Just Transition to a Low Carbon Economy, awarded by the European Commission. We know Raphaël Heffron thanks to the European Federation of Energy Law Association, the FLA, in which the UPPA professor Philippe Terner is member of the Scientific Council. I want to say that our involvement in energy law and FLA and this conference wouldn't have been possible without the E2S project. The originality of E2S UPPA is to promote high quality research on energy and environmental issues. That's why the entire UPPA scientific community, physicians, chemists, mathematicians, sociologists, lawyers, could work together on the most difficult and exciting topics addressed by environmental and energy transitions. Today, we will speak about one of these topics, the problematic of climate change and its consequences. And perhaps carbon capture could play a role against global warming. And we are very fortunate to discuss this issue with Professor Heffron, with one of the best European specialists on this topic. Dear Raphaël, thank you again for agreeing to be here today, and I give you the floor.
So, thank you very much to Louis, and thank you very much to the other academics who have made me welcome yesterday and today, and I'll also be here briefly tomorrow. So, and I should say hello to those who will be watching from other campuses as well. So someone said to me today that, you know, there will be many people watching on YouTube, and I can say that, you know, law overall is getting more popular. Earlier this year, I did a Facebook Live presentation, and that had 150,000 views. So, you know, people are getting more and more excited by the law. So, I just want to say a few words about myself. So, I am the consulting editor of the Halsbury's Law of England Energy Law series. And let's say the significance of that is it is the major practitioner series in the UK. And considering that internationally a lot of global energy deals are governed by common law from England and Wales, that is the series that a lot of practitioners go to. You know, one of the themes that I think you know, will be developed over here in time in terms of researching energy is an interdisciplinary focus. I myself, after I qualified, did a PhD in interdisciplinary energy group in Cambridge, and just some of the other things I've been part of: an expert advisor to the UN, EU, the World Bank, and also in the past and currently, let's say I have a global outlook in that I've been a visiting academic or professor in Oxford, MIT, in the US, London, Australia, Paris, Colombia, West Indies, and in Africa, in Mozambique. And also, as well as having the PhD, I'm a barrister at law in the UK. So in the UK, we do have that distinction between solicitor and barrister. And that's not, the word barrister is not to be confused with barista, the person who makes your coffee. And I remember when I went back to university to do my PhD, another student said to me, so what did you do before you came back to study? And I said I was a barrister. And they said, why does someone who makes coffee need to come back and do a PhD? So, I internally, in my mind, I was thinking they're letting everyone into Cambridge these days. But I stopped. But in terms of the topic, let's say that I'm talking to you about today, as well as carbon capture storage, but also the just transition to a low-carbon economy, it is one of the key topics of focus in terms of thinking into the future. And in terms of the award I received from the European Commission in terms of the Jean Monnet Professorship earlier this year in September, I think that's a statement of what the European Commission want to achieve. And I will say more about that later. But for some of you may not know where I'm coming from in the UK, and you can see, the red dot up there in Dundee. And why has Dundee got an energy, petroleum, mineral law and policy centre? Well, the reason is off the coast there of Dundee is where all the UK oil and gas was found. And what the government at the time and society wanted was a group of experts, and that's where the centre was established 42 years ago. So we're the world's oldest energy law centre. And, I want to also highlight something about Dundee itself. So I've heard, how this city is very good. You can play golf, which I did yesterday, but you can also ski, you can mountain climb, you're not too far from the beach. Well, I would tell you all today that you just have to look at Dundee, in the north of Scotland, and you see these media reports, Lonely Planet, which some of you may read, top 10 destination Dundee. Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, a great place to get energy data. And I particularly like this one when I was presenting earlier this year, both in Indonesia and the Caribbean. Dundee is even ahead of tropical islands as a place to visit. So as you come along to the Christmas season in the next few weeks, and you're stuck for thinking about a present to buy your loved one, your partner, what could be better than saying, next year we're going to go to the romantic city of Dundee, one of the top places to visit in the world. And while you're there, you can leave your loved one to walk around beautiful Dundee, and you can come and experience a great time about learning energy law and policy. So over our 42 years, we have students who have entered through the doors from 140 different countries. So we have an alumni which stretches all across the world. We currently have, I think, 5 ministers for energy who have been educated at Dundee in different places in the world, in Africa and South America in particular. And, for those who are interested more in reading and less watching, Netflix or other TV shows in the evening, we do have our own energy law journal. So Global Energy Law and Sustainability, which will be out next year. But I want to mention first, that at the moment we live in a world that is changing. And you want to think of all the different changes. And one of the biggest ones we can think of is around the energy transition. And when we think of the energy transition, we can think of that figure up there on the board. 44 trillion will be spent by 2040. And I say to the students who enter my class in September, if you, as a commercial lawyer, get even a very small fraction of that 44 trillion, 0.00001, you will be a very rich person. And I say, you have made the right choice as a lawyer. Don't do family law. Don't do criminal law. It's energy law where the money is. 44 trillion will be spent in new energy infrastructure by 2040. You can also look at the figure at the bottom there. Around 10% of global GDP expenditure is energy related. What that means in simple terms is 1 out of every $10 spent in the world is energy related. Can anyone guess what is the other biggest sector in the economy that has a similar expenditure to energy? So one that we all come into contact with over our lifetime, sadly, is health. So health is around 10% as well. So the two big areas in our economies are health and energy. And if we're thinking today, we can see that link between health and energy increasing, the relationship increasing all the time. And if we're thinking about a just transition to a low-carbon economy, going beyond the energy sector, thinking about that crossover into the rest of our economies, that figure of 44 trillion goes up to 75 trillion. And in connecting to something that we are increasingly all becoming aware of, the Sustainable Development Goals, which our countries, our governments have signed up for. You have 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And there is research in one of the biggest journals in the world, Nature Energy, which highlights that energy is the fundamental Sustainable Development Goal. If you solve that, you will nearly solve 85% of the rest of the Sustainable Development Goals. That's how important the energy sector is to our society. And another reason we can think of that the world is changing is, the mobile phone. We all have a mobile phone. We use it every day. Some of you may even have 2 mobile phones. But you think about the technology of the mobile phone. For some of the students in the room, your grandparents may not even yet be able to use a mobile phone. And they can only, when you show them how to use it, it's something maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago they could never think would exist. And the mobile phone shows us about the global links in the energy sector. So if we think about the rare metal, one of the rare metals used in a mobile phone is coltan. Cobalt. And cobalt is extracted here in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The tax rate that the government get there is equivalent to 1.5%. And we think as cobalt is exported over to Asia, and in Asia it is used to, let's say, to manufacture a mobile phone, and then we use our phone in Europe, and we think of the USA where a lot of the revenue goes. And we think in the USA, we could say Apple. Apple is earning roughly, let's say, a profit of 15% on the mobile phone. And what we can think of is this global supply chain for a rare mineral. And that contrasts in who is getting the money. The money is not ending up in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A lot of the money is ending up in the US. And if we're thinking even further, the money doesn't really ever enter the US. It usually stays or gets directed into tax havens. I think Apple at the moment currently has something like 250 billion in offshore bank accounts. So, like never before, we can think that the energy sector more broadly is a global industry. And we can see this also in terms of CO2 emissions. And you don't have to understand this diagram in detail, but the idea is to show that generally it is developing countries that are experiencing the effect of the CO2 emissions. You know, they are in many cases developing, in many cases manufacturing different products that we use in the developed world. We are in many ways exporting our CO2 problems to the developed world. And we can see already in some jurisdictions that there is action happening. So in Australia earlier in March, in a decision against a coal mine, so to prevent a coal mine opening, a judge said Australia has to consider the use of that coal abroad. So that coal being burnt somewhere else in the world, the CO2 emissions that are emitted, Australia is responsible. And the judge said we do not want to be responsible for CO2 emitted across borders. And depending on where you are in the world, someone could say, well, it's easy for Australia to make that decision. They're a rich country, a developed country. But we can see earlier in June, in a similar way, a coal plant in Kenya was stopped. So although Kenya has more need for energy, at the same time, they did not want this coal infrastructure. So we are seeing some movement at a legal level. So we're in France, and most of you will recognize this image. Does anyone know why it's a very famous place for lawyers to visit? What's very famous for lawyers to run down? I think it's 2 floors down in the basement, and you always see lawyers running down to get their picture taken in their suit. So despite going on holiday to Paris, you know, they bring not only their tourist clothes, but they always bring their suit as well. Can anyone tell me what's in the basement of the Louvre? So in other parts of the world, people have guessed, or they have, let's say, been, but it's where the oldest legal document is meant to be in the world. So I think it's a taxation document, and it's very popular for lawyers to get their picture taken. So if you ever wondered why you're in the Louvre and you saw loads of people in their suits running down, well, now you know why. Or maybe the next time you go, you will bring your own suit. So, you know, we can think of the Paris Agreement in 2015 being very influential in terms of the energy transition. And some people would say, well, there isn't a lot that is binding in the Paris Agreement. But I would argue differently and say, never before have you had so many countries sign up to an agreement so fast. 188 countries signed up in less than 3 years. They signed and ratified the Paris Agreement. That has sent a big sort of statement to industry, a big statement to business, the financial world. And we need to think the world is looking at that agreement and looking to see the potential change. And, you know, there has been talk about the US leaving, fully leaving the Paris Agreement. And I would say to those people, you know, like Donald Trump, or I don't know, maybe if there's maybe one or two people who don't believe in climate change in the audience, I won't ask you to put your hand up, but I would say you can look at this cartoon image and you think, when you're thinking of the Paris Agreement, you know, what we are trying to achieve is a better world. What we're trying to achieve is livable cities, green jobs, healthy children, clean water, clean air, etc. So, as the person asks, you know, even if climate change isn't real, what's wrong with trying to create a better world? And that is the answer to, you know, those who don't believe in climate change. What we are trying to achieve is a better world now and into the future. But when we're thinking of, you know, the energy transition, we're thinking there are a number of other reasons it is growing in importance. And one of them is, you know, that we are still feeling the effects of the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. You know, after a crisis, people become more conservative. The financial industry becomes more conservative. They do not want to take on too much risk. And this is a big issue as we think of climate change. And it has a major issue in terms of energy projects. To get the money for energy projects, you have to go through more legal hurdles than you had to go through before. There are a set of international standards in the Basel Conventions, the Equator Principles around environmental impact assessments. They are more severe than ever before, so it's harder to get permission, it's harder to get the money to build oil, gas or coal projects. We can also see over the last decade the impact of the leaks around taxation issues. So some of you may be aware, or you may have read or heard about the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers. Two leaks. If you look at those books, you will see energy-related issues mentioned many times. Globally, multinational energy companies repeatedly use, for nearly every big commercial deal, they are using tax havens. Anyone who's interested in international arbitration, if you look at some of the big arbitration cases, a lot of companies taking the case against a government are from tax havens. British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, the list goes on. And you ask, the company set themselves up in a tax haven and they're now suing the government. From the outset, they were planning to pay no tax. And now they think they can sue the government because their project, didn't complete, or there was some delay in their project, or the project got taken off them. So we can see greater standards of disclosure and transparency that are required. We can also see the influence of major economists. So most of you will recognize a couple of the names there, two French economists, one who's won the Nobel Prize. But if you read the Economics for the Common Good by Jean Tirole, he talks about how law has a fundamental role to play in the energy and climate crisis. You can also look at Joseph Stiglitz talking about inequality and legal and energy issues there. And many of you recognize the middle economist, someone that many people believe will win the Nobel Prize within the next 5 years. But again, he has research conducted with environmental scientists, I believe, where they show the more CO2 you produce, the more societal inequality you have. And that's why we can no longer send a message that we can continue to emit CO2 because we are creating greater societal inequality. We can also follow medical data, and we can see, you can look at the figure here, 6.2% of global economic output is lost due to pollution per year. This is a key reason why policymakers are realizing they have to do something. If your country has a slow economic growth rate, one other way of increasing that economic growth is to tackle the issue of pollution. Economists are generally cynical people. And if you look at this statistic, 9 million premature deaths are due to pollution. So that's around 16% of all global deaths or premature global deaths are due to pollution. So if you were to, let's say maybe in a simplistic way to calculate that, 1 out of every 5 people in the room here today is going to die a premature death due to pollution. And what the economists would tell you is they aren't so much interested that you are going to die. What they are interested in is you are dying prematurely. Therefore, society loses your economic input to the economy. So if you die at 50 rather than 65 when you should retire, we lose 15 years of your valuable economic life. And that's what they are concerned about. So, and again, this is a key reason why policymakers are interested. And when we think of, the areas I've spoken about in the leading scientific journal in the world, again, they are talking about this issue of the transition. They are talking about this as being a major social justice issue. And if you read Nature, which is out every week, generally the editorial each week is mentioning the issue of climate change, energy, justice. And that's in contrast to maybe 4 or 5 years ago when there was little reflection on the issue of justice. And we can also see that in Nature Energy, which is the most cited journal in the world, even higher than Nature itself. And Nature Energy accepts now articles on justice. It wants essentially more articles to come from essentially the legal community. And if you look at the articles in this journal, most of the people are talking about justice. The people who are talking about justice are not lawyers. I would say 90 to 95% are from other disciplines. And they are making assumptions that in many cases, I would argue, are wrong. To give you one example, they would say, well, one way of tackling the issue of climate change is to build a nuclear power plant. So let's sort out everything and build a nuclear power plant. They never really reflect on the fact that to get a nuclear power plant approved in terms of an environmental impact statement, in many countries that's going to take 4 years, even up to 8 years. That has a significant delay on your project. It adds significant costs. And it's something that doesn't, in many cases, even enter into their articles. So there is a need for more lawyers to step forward. And I think, from my perspective, this is one of the most exciting times for lawyers because actually, let's say in contrast to 5 or 10 years ago, now everyone wants to work on justice issues. Everyone is saying, I'm interested in societal inequality, how we can have more justice. And there are loads of people out there that we can start working with. And when we're thinking of justice, we are thinking of different forms of justice. What does that word in, a just transition to a low-carbon economy mean? Well, essentially, what we want in the next economy, what we want in the low-carbon economy, we do not want the current society that the energy sector has influenced us to have, where 1% of the world's population own 50% of the world's wealth, where we have this massive pollution going on all over the world. So we want a new energy sector. We want an energy sector that is just and that contributes to an economy and society that is just. And for that, we need forms of justice such as distributive justice, procedural justice, recognition justice, restorative justice. And the last one is one that has been confused or distorted by those people who drink Cosmopolitan cocktails on a Friday, maybe some of you tomorrow, or some of you who have been reading Cosmopolitan. But, the other and final form of justice which we all need to have is cosmopolitan justice. And that is, a thousands of years old justice, where a Greek philosopher was saying, asked where he was from, he said, I am a citizen of the world. And that's the way we need to be thinking about the energy sector. That is the way, in the earlier judgment in the Australian court, that is the way they were thinking. This coal extracted from Australia is going to have an effect beyond our borders. And we need to think about the global effect of what we are doing, what the energy companies in our countries are doing globally. And in terms of that initiative, there are many, let's say Dundee, our university is involved, and we'll be hosting, which I hope some of the academics here will be attending next April. But we are working with a range of different institutions, different universities that represent different places all over the world. And in that context of a just transition to a low-carbon economy, this was mentioned in the Paris Agreement. However, it did not receive a lot of attention initially. So it wasn't really until 2 years later people started asking, well, what does this just transition mean? And now what it means over those last 2 years, since 2017, people are talking about that societal shift, the major impact that the energy sector has on society. And it needs a whole range of interdisciplinary thinking. If you're working in the energy sector, you have to be thinking about issues such as labour. The transition to a low-carbon economy means some sectors, there is no longer going to be employment in those sectors. Those people will have to transition to other jobs. There will be other new jobs. In the US today, for every one job in fossil fuels, there are 10 jobs in the green economy. And even Trump cannot deny that figure, although he restricted the Department of Labour from releasing that data. So we can also think of the issue of health. We can think of industry policy. Every sector is using energy, and we need to think about how every sector is using energy. And an example to show that policymakers are thinking of this just transition to a low-carbon economy is from last year. when the G7 talks were happening. It should have been the G8, but Donald Trump ran off at the end, so the US didn't sign the communique. But that agreement between the G7 countries mentions the just transition and how it's an objective for those countries. But we can look in a legal way. Already some countries are taking action. Countries are forming what is referred to as just transition commissions. They are forming that as a unit of a government department or an expert commission that advises a government department. And we can see that these just transition commissions are trying to force change all across society in terms of how we use energy. And you can see early forms of this already within legislation in Scotland, Ireland, Germany, New Zealand, the US, South Africa. And what we see are that this is essentially public administrative law. And we have to say countries are going down differing paths. We can think, what are the powers this unit is going to have? Who are the members? What are the goals and targets that it has to achieve? And we can see in Germany, the idea in Germany is to end the use of coal by 2038. And they have, or they want to have allocated 1.3 billion per year to end the use of coal. So countries are getting serious. They're putting the money behind these legal developments. And in another one, in terms of a conference earlier this year, the Harvard Just Transition Initiative, an academic group in Harvard, they have 4 trillion worth of investor funds who have signed up to rules around investing towards a just transition to a low-carbon economy. So that is the potential impact academics and the research community can have, that we can influence investment and how investment is made in the economy in the future. And in terms of thinking at the climate change talks, which are beginning next week, last year at the climate change talks, the just transition to a low-carbon economy was a dominant issue, and it looks set to be one of the dominant themes in this year's event. So, overall, we can think that the just transition to a low-carbon economy is one of the biggest challenges of our time, and we can think of the energy sector where all of us here today have a role to play. And one of the key issues for that development of a low-carbon economy is around carbon capture storage. And in thinking about a low-carbon economy, we want to make sure we have different options. You have to diversify your options in order to achieve the low-carbon economy. So you need a mix of solutions. So different governments around the world are investing in CCS. I think there are 31 projects internationally in carbon capture storage. But we need to address from a legal perspective some of the challenges. And when we're thinking from a legal perspective, we can go down and think of issues from an international law perspective, a national perspective, and also a local perspective. And we can do an assessment of the legislation, which we did, on the Netherlands, the UK, and Belgium. And in many cases, we can solve all the legal hurdles. But the big issue is around liability. Who is going to take the risk on building carbon capture storage? Who's going to take the risk if anything goes wrong. And that is a debate between, let's say, the energy companies and also governments and also the public. There are arguments by the public. Have we not subsidized the coal and gas industry enough already? Why should we pay for that risk? There are arguments on the other side. Well, we need a solution. If we keep emitting CO2, it doesn't matter who pays as long as we solve the problem. So this continues to be the major issue as to why carbon capture storage has not, let's say, yet been developed. But as we think of a low-carbon economy, we think of all those reasons that there is now more of an incentive than ever before to support a solution like carbon capture storage. And when we're thinking of this as a policy option, we need, again, international cooperation. And the literature in terms of project management tells us that many of the delays in building this complex energy technology are because of law. We can't essentially get legal agreements or legal contracts in place to build these projects. And risk is the key issue. But for those who are interested in reading more, there's an article that different companies, different academics and researchers from across the EU, we've detailed some of these arguments about how carbon capture storage can contribute to the development of a low-carbon economy. But when we are thinking of the energy sector more broadly, we want to be thinking of solutions that satisfy certain principles. And there is a set of principles of energy law. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but the idea is our policy options, so such as, let's say, carbon capture storage, such as renewable energy, such as nuclear power, they satisfy a lot of these energy law principles. And we need to be making decisions that satisfy justice and a way that we will have that just transition to a low-carbon economy. And if we take a principle-based approach, our policy options become more narrow. We don't end up supporting some of the older energy sources. And to highlight and to mention the European Federation of Energy Law Associations, we were at a meeting last year with the judges of the European Courts of Justice, so some of the key judges who are making decisions on the big energy cases. And one of the issues that we raised, or we were talking to them about, again, was we need to have a more principle-based approach to what we want from energy law. We need to think about how we want justice in our energy sectors. And when energy companies challenge decisions, we should be thinking about a public policy that looks towards developing this low-carbon economy. And I just want to leave you with a final thought. This issue is becoming, more and more visible all across the world. There are projects stopping in developing countries just as much as in developed countries. And that's despite, in many developing countries, energy access, money is much more important for local populations. And, we can leave you with, this picture of Venice. So I've taken you on a tour of some of the most romantic cities of Europe, from Dundee to Paris to Venice. But if you think of Venice you can think of this poor young couple, my friends, who got married, and they went over to Venice on their honeymoon. He had just purchased a nice pair of Italian leather shoes. 300 euros, gone. Had to throw them in the bin. You know, their holiday or their honeymoon ruined. And you think, you know, this shows many issues. The effects of climate change. You can see, you know, increasing sort of freak weather events, and that's what we want to stop. The effect on tourism in Venice, the effect on business day to day in Venice, because no longer can some of the shops get insurance, business insurance to operate, because this is repeatedly happening. No insurance company wants to insure them. And you can also think of the visibility. You can send an image, everyone can see it. It can go around the world in minutes. And we need to think more and more these changes are visible. And as we face up to this challenge, more and more we want to see justice happening. And you can see it in developing countries. They are rejecting big multinational companies because they can see an image where they can say, yes, you're a Canadian company, you may want to come in here and extract. We saw what you did in an African country. We don't want you in our country. And this is beginning to have, to make big, big changes. So I will leave you, let's say, there are a number of papers that my talk is based on. I'll be happy to share them to anyone who's interested. And I will leave you with that quote from, you know, the great painter Michelangelo. In terms of setting our objectives, we should be setting our objectives much higher than we are. We should be aiming to achieve much more. And for those young people in the audience, you should start to dream much bigger than you ever did before. And you should make sure that the older generation are leaving you with the world, you know, that you do want to live in future. So thank you very much.
First of all, thank you for your intervention. Also, I would prefer to ask the question in English. So my question is, there are many articles, many reviews that predict great effect of lithium extraction in all of these contexts. So my question is, according to your point of view, more than indeed there is going to be a huge change in economy, probably in the carbon emissions and the climate change effect of this lithium exploitation. What's your prediction, or what's your opinion on how this political or law against climate change to protect us against climate change, or can it help us to avoid a huge impact in carbon emissions?
Well, if I understand your question fully, I think you know, we are seeing a lot of change already in terms of, let's say, where the money is going. So politicians are thinking, where are we going to invest? And we should always remember the link between politics and big business. And some of the banks are already thinking about the just transition to a low-carbon economy, because they are thinking, how, as a bank, will we invest over 10, 15, 20, 25 years? And they are thinking, you know, they don't want to invest in risky projects. And I think that's where something like, let's say, carbon capture storage will be seen as a less risky investment, even if some countries continue to emit highly. We do need the technology to help them. Part of the idea of the Paris Agreement is governments are meant to, in the developed world, are meant to ensure that there's technology transfer from the developed world to the developing world. It hasn't quite fully happened yet, but maybe we need stronger politicians. And maybe you could argue, if you look at Brazil, America, even the UK at the moment, we do not have politicians who are delivering that message. And I just had a picture, but in the interest of time, I didn't mention it. But this is the city of Jakarta in Indonesia. And there are 24 million people living in this city and the surrounding area. And a report came out in August where they said by 2050, Jakarta will be underwater. You have to change, or you have to move 24 million people by 2050. That's going to change the whole economy of Indonesia. But yet, at the event I was speaking at, people were from the government department, from a former minister for energy, they were saying, when they were talking about the energy transition, they were saying, coal will continue to be part of the energy transition. I wasn't sure how that made sense, but this is internationally, you know, there is a huge issue in terms of ensuring that politics thinks the same way, let's say, as the scientists.
Hello, thanks for the talk. It was very interesting. So I'm with you with trying to have kind of more equality in energy. So my background is more science from physics and math, and so it's more a comment rather than a question. But I have the feeling that you were mentioning economic input, money. All these things are about, so money, for example, is about trust and paper in the end. Energy is about joules and watts, and in different form, electricity, chemical, nuclear. At some point, having more economic input, having this growth in mind, is, I think, part of the problem of the energy. So I see some contradiction in the way of hoping that technology, so carbon capture, for example, is kind of a solution. So I don't know if the kind of thing you are also addressing, or is it just, do you have an opinion on that? Do you consider the physics as energy as first principle is there or not, basically?
I think that, let's say there is one view that the energy is already there. And using the example of carbon capture storage, you know, there are 31 projects globally. But at the moment, no one is willing to take that risk on. The politicians are not willing to say to the energy companies, you must do this. Equally, the politicians are not willing to say, you must use more nuclear energy. And you can think in Germany, they made a decision to go against nuclear energy. And the last I looked, if I look at the science would tell me that Germany is not really going to experience a tsunami. But yet the people said after Fukushima, you know, one of the arguments, potentially at some point in the future that we experience a tsunami, we want to close down nuclear energy. And you had a lot of the Green lobby complaining about nuclear energy. And I would say, over the last 2 or 3 years, as Germany has pushed to open more coal mines, to develop more coal projects, to build more energy, when they actually have it already, I would say, where are the Green lobby in Germany today? Why aren't they objecting to the reopening of coal? There is one argument that technology, in many cases, the technology is nearly already there, but it is law, policy, and economics which is preventing the widespread use of that technology. No, I think if anything, we need more and more energy. So we need more and more energy infrastructure to be built. And that is, we need.
Yeah, sorry, that's the point of the physicist. So energy is not something that you create. Energy is conserved by definition in terms of physics. And the energy exists in the form of nucleus, of chemicals, or process in terms of wind moving. But you cannot build an infrastructure that creates energy. You can only transform it. So as soon as you don't have any more oil, coal, whatever, it's done, it's finished. So you will have a huge infrastructure, but nothing to fire it up, even to store carbon. So I don't see a result in this past.
Well, that would be the view that, we need more and more research to ensure there are other ways of getting energy and not from coal, oil, or gas. The same way you can think about the pharmaceutical industry. Just because we could make one type of drug for very cheap, we still try and choose a better option. We still try and incentivize a better option. And I think that's where, as long as we keep the option open for coal or gas or even oil, we will continue to use them. So, and we will continue to fund research into those sources. So we need to fund, there needs to be new funding or funding redirected into these newer forms of energy.
So you didn't say much about carbon capture and storage. I thought it was the key point of the presentation. Actually, you hardly talked about it. So could you please go back to the study you talked about on 3 countries, and you said the major issue for those countries was liability issues. Could you explain what you mean when you say liability issues? And then.
So, in a way, let's say by thinking about a low carbon economy, by thinking about a just transition to a low carbon economy, that the economy or the situation is there for carbon capture storage to be a solution. It is the time, now is the time for it to be utilized as a solution. And when we're thinking of the development of a low carbon economy, carbon capture storage can play a huge solution, not just in the developed world, but particularly in developing countries. So in a way, that's part of my argument that a lot of what can be achieved with carbon capture storage, a lot of the, let's say, the technology is there. We know what we can achieve. We know what the social, environmental and economic impact can be. And that is all present. So when we are thinking of, let's say, project management of how we can get this carbon capture storage built, there are very few challenges left. And if anything, through the low carbon economy, its use is supported more. But the last issue we haven't solved is this issue of liability. And that comes down to companies, let's say, who are producing CO2, they do not yet want to take on all the risk. They are not happy to take on 100% of the risk of the project. And they are asking governments to share the risk. And governments are saying, well, we have shared the risk with you for many things, even decommissioning some of your coal or oil or gas projects. Now you're asking us to share the risk for your CO2 emissions. So until that, let's say, debate about where the responsibility should lie is resolved, it will not feature as part of a low carbon economy. When, if we want our transition, we have to face up that there's too much CO2 being emitted. We do need a solution fast, and that, let's say, should mean in some way that society needs to take on more of the risk, but you could argue equally higher taxes should then be placed on these energy companies. They should not be allowed to utilize tax havens, for example. So the whole other range of issues, there needs to be, let's say, a balance between how energy companies operate and how much, let's say, society is prepared to take on the risk of potentially their environmental damage. So in a way, what I'm trying to suggest that the platform is there for carbon capture storage. We just can't solve this final problem.
So you think it's mainly an economical problem? That's an economical risk.
A law and economic problem about apportioning the risk.
And what about social acceptability? Because you had, some problems around the Barendrecht project in the Netherlands, for instance. And you have many examples like that, where you have resistances on the ground, around projects that are actually implemented. And they're just pilot projects. That's not even a big industrial project. So I think that's very important to take that into account, the matter of acceptability.
Yes, I would agree. I suppose people are referring to this as a social license to operate. And it is a challenge to get that social acceptance or social license. But I think there are examples to show that even that you can overcome that challenge. But despite being able to overcome that challenge, the project still falls back on this issue of how do we address the liability. And let's say there is that liability issue does come into play where a government is saying, what is the impact if there is an accident, what is the impact on the local community? Who is going to, is it us that pays all the damages? So it's linked to that. There is a social issue within that liability issue. But I would say in many cases you can show how you can get through that social acceptance and get the planning and environmental permission to go ahead.
Thank you, Raphaël.